Blackstone Audio presents God in the Dark, Essays on Theology and Ethics by C.S. Lewis, edited by Walter Hooper. Preface. Dr. Johnson, speaking of an 18th century theologian, remarked that he tended to unsettle everything and yet settle nothing. I wonder what the robust doctor would make of our age, an age in which one sees in most bookshops and Sunday papers the controversial and oftentimes apostate works of clergy who unsettle every article of the faith they are ordained and paid to uphold. It is, partly because of this, a pleasure for me to offer as an antidote this new book by C.S. Lewis. I say new because, though these essays and letters were written over a period of 24 years, almost all are published in book form for the first time. Considering how rapidly theological fashions change, it might be expected that these pieces would already be old stuff. There are, however, I expect, others like myself who are more concerned with whether a book is true than whether it was written last week. I believe that Lewis's refusal to compromise, neck or nothing, heaven or hell, does not for one moment detract from their relevance to the basic problems which still assail us. Because of my desire to read everything that Lewis wrote, I undertook the long but happy task of excavating his contributions to ephemeral publications. Now, at last, my years of searching libraries and reading faded newsprint are over. But, more important, I anticipate that the majority of them will have never been seen by most readers, and I hope they will derive as much satisfaction as I do from having them firmly stitched between two boards. Since these new Lewisiana have been culled from such a wide variety of sources, they make, as might be expected, a very mixed bag. I do not apologize for this, because so much of their interest lies in the many different angles from which we are able to view the Christian religion. Lewis never received a penny for most of them. Some of the essays were written simply because he felt the topic badly needed ventilating and the healthy position defending. Others at the request of a newspaper or a periodical. There are other pieces, such as the ones from the Socratic Digest, which he composed for the purpose of defending the faith against the attacks of agnostics and atheists. Because Lewis knew how to adapt his material to suit the audience he was writing for, the essays differ both in length and in emphasis. Nevertheless, all share a particular seriousness. Not gloominess, for they sparkle with wit and common sense, but seriousness because of the high stakes which Lewis believed were involved in being a man, a possible son of God, or a possible candidate for hell. During his years as an agnostic, Lewis wanted to know the answers to such questions as why God allows pain, why Christianity, out of all other religions, was held to be the true one, why and if miracles actually happened. As a result, he quite naturally anticipated the questions other men asked. After his conversion in 1931, Lewis, who seldom refused an invitation to speak or write about the faith, found himself moving in very different circles. He preached to and argued with fellow dons, industrial workers, members of the Royal Air Force, and university students. It was partly due to this varied experience that he came to see why the professional theologians could not make Christianity understandable to most people. As a result, he set himself the task of translating the gospel into language which men use and understand. He believed that if you found it difficult to answer questions from men of different trades, it was probably because you haven't really thought it out, not to the end, not to the absolute ruddy end. There were many Christians in Oxford in the early 1940s who, like Lewis, felt that both the pros and the cons of the Christian religion should be discussed openly. This led to the foundation of the Socratic Club in 1941. Lewis was the obvious person for the presidency, a position he held until he went to Cambridge in 1954. Meetings were, and still are, held every Monday evening in term. One Monday, a Christian would read a paper to be answered by an unbeliever, and the following Monday, an agnostic or atheist would read a paper which was, in turn, answered by a Christian. Lewis had always relished rational opposition, and the Socratic Club served as the perfect arena for testing the strengths and weaknesses of his apologetics. One example of the kind of paper he read at the Socratic is Religion Without Dogma, which he wrote as a reply to Professor H. Price's paper on The Grounds of Modern Agnosticism. It was difficult for the most able unbeliever to contend with Lewis's formidable logic and immense learning in the Socratic Club. On the other hand, we find him, in his articles in the Coventry Evening Telegraph and popular magazines, adapting his language and logic to less educated people. Pieces such as Religion and Science and The Trouble with X, with their lucidity and apt analogies, have unmasked many popular fallacies about the supposed opposition between religion and science, and have led many people to understand what Christianity is about. Regardless of one's education, it is impossible to decide whether Christianity is true or false if you do not know what it is about. And just as there were many who were totally ignorant of Christianity when Lewis began to write, so there are many today who do not know what the real issue is. It is foolish to pretend. The recent flood of autobiographical explanations why such and such a bishop or parson cannot accept the Christian faith has, I expect, driven many people into deeper ignorance, and also, perhaps, into the despairing belief that it could not be understood, however hard one tried. For Lewis, who believed that to be born meant either an eventual surrender to God or an everlasting divorce from him, this was a serious matter. One day, he and I were speculating as to what would happen if a group of friendly and inquisitive Martians suddenly appeared in the middle of Oxford and asked those who did not flee what Christianity is. We wondered how many people, apart from voicing their prejudices about the Church, could supply them with much in the way of accurate information. On the whole, we doubted whether the Martians would take back to their world much that is worth having. On the other hand, there is nothing, Lewis argued, in the nature of the younger generation which incapacitates them for receiving Christianity. But, as he goes on to say, no generation can bequeath to its successors what it has not got. What it has not got. The question as to why it has not got it is obviously too complex for me to answer. Nevertheless, having been a college chaplain for 5 years, I can see that much of the ignorance today is rightly attributed by Lewis to the liberal writers who are continually accommodating and whittling down the truth of the gospel. And what Lewis would most emphatically not do is whittle down. He believed that, regardless of the temporary fashions which our ideas about God and morality pass through, there is nothing which can make the everlasting gospel out of date. All that is not eternal is eternally out of date. On the other hand, he believed that our methods of getting the truth across must often vary. Indeed, his own methods vary considerably. But he nowhere attempts to empty God out with the bathwater. For instance, we have from Lewis's pen straightforward apologetical work such as Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain, theological satire such as The Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce, and, for lack of a better word, his concealed Christianity in the interplanetary novels and the Chronicles of Narnia. Though Lewis's methods are not acceptable to liberal theologians, see, for example, his rejoinder to Dr. Pittenger, he has probably got more orthodox Christianity into more heads than any religious writer since G.K. Chesterton. His graceful prose, his easy conversational style, almost all his books are written in the first person, his striking metaphors and love of clarity are, no doubt, chiefly the result of his wide reading, his delight in writing, and his large share of mother wit. But they are more closely related than those who have read only his theological books might imagine to his abilities as a literary critic. Beginning with his literary criticism and going on to his theological works, one will probably find that the process works the other way round as well. However, the point I particularly want to emphasize is this. Lewis believed that the proper work of a literary critic is to write about the merits and faults of a book, rather than to speculate about the genesis of the book or the author's private life. Though he had a high regard for textual criticism and lectured on it at one time, he never overlooked the obvious in favor of the hypothetical. Similarly, in his theological works, Lewis, who never claimed to be more than a layman writing for other laymen, does not offer ingenious guesses about whether, say, such and such a passage in one of the Gospels was supplied by the early church long after that Gospel was written, but what the Gospels, as we have them, do, in fact, say and mean. The essays in this book, which are more or less straight theology, fall into two groups. The first contains those in which the primary topic is miracles. Lewis maintained that the faith stripped of its supernatural elements could not conceivably be called Christianity. Because the miraculous is too toned down or hushed up today, I feel that his essays on the miraculous are particularly ripe for publication. Though most of what he says about miracles and the self-refutation of naturalists can be found in his full-length book on Miracles, London, 1947, revised 1960, I believe that the short essays here could have one advantage over the book. They might appeal to readers who have not the leisure to read, or who might get bogged down in longer works. The second category is hinted at in the title of this book. The ancient man, Lewis wrote, approached God, or even the gods, as the accused person approaches his judge. For the modern man, the roles are reversed. He is the judge. God is in the dock. It would be ridiculous to suppose we can easily put man back in the dock. Lewis discusses his own methods for attempting this in his essay on Christian Apologetics, the only essay in this volume which has never been published in any form before. In my experience, he says in this essay, if one begins from the sin that has been one's chief problem during the last week, one is very often surprised at the way this shaft goes home. Those who have read Screwtape will recall numerous instances in which he pinpoints those seemingly small sins which, if allowed to grow unchecked, in the end dominate man. As for the essays that follow, I should be surprised if those who read The Trouble with X do not have the sensation, which I do, of seeing their reflection in a mirror. Lewis struck me as the most thoroughly converted man I ever met. Christianity was never for him a separate department of life. Not what he did with his solitude, not even, as he says in one essay, what God does with his solitude. His whole vision of life was such that the natural and the supernatural seemed inseparably combined. Because of this, I have included in this collection his numerous semi-theological essays on topics such as the proposed ordination of women and vivisection. There are also a number of essays such as the humanitarian theory of punishment, which could more properly be called ethical. Lastly, because of my concern that nothing be lost, I have added to the back of this book all Lewis's letters on theology and ethics that have appeared in newspapers and magazines. The absence of moral values is so acutely felt today that it would seem a pity not to make public whatever help is available to our confused and spiritually starved world. There may be contemporary writers who strike us as more humane, tender, original, and up-to-date than Lewis. But, like the Three Little Pigs, we need not straw, but firm brick houses. Those who are concerned about the cheap religion and shoddy values so typical of our times will be aware of our immediate need for the antidote which Lewis provides. His realism, his moral rectitude, his ability to see beyond the partial perspectives which limit so many existentialists. Though these essays do not fall easily into neat subdivisions, I have, nevertheless, felt that divisions of some sort would be helpful to the reader. I have, therefore, divided the essays into 3 parts, conscious, while doing so, that some of the essays would fit almost as well in one part as they would in another. Part 1 contains those essays which are clearly theological. Part 2 contains those which I term semi-theological, and Part 3 includes those in which the basic theme is ethics. Part 4 is composed of Lewis's letters arranged in the chronological order in which they were published. Walter Hooper, Jesus College, Oxford, May 1970. Part 1. 1. Evil and God. Dr. Joad's article on God and Evil in The Spectator last week, 31st of January 1941, suggests the interesting conclusion that since neither mechanism nor emergent evolution will hold water, we must choose in the long run between some monotheistic philosophy, like the Christian, and some such dualism as that of the Zoroastrians. I agree with Dr. Joad in rejecting mechanism and emergent evolution. Mechanism, like all materialist systems, breaks down at the problem of knowledge. If thought is the undesigned and irrelevant product of cerebral motions, what reason have we to trust it? As for emergent evolution, if anyone insists on using the word God to mean whatever the universe happens to be going to do next, of course we cannot prevent him. But nobody would, in fact, so use it unless he had a secret belief that what is coming next will be an improvement. Such a belief, besides being unwarranted, presents peculiar difficulties to an emergent evolutionist. If things can improve, this means that there must be some absolute standard of good above and outside the cosmic process to which that process can approximate. There is no sense in talking of becoming better if better means simply what we are becoming. It is like congratulating yourself on reaching your destination and defining destination as the place you have reached. Melancholatry, or the worship of the future, is a fuddled religion. We are left then to choose between monotheism and dualism, between a single, good, almighty source of being and two equal, uncreated, antagonistic powers, one good and the other bad. Dr. Joad suggests that the latter view stands to gain from the new urgency of the fact of evil. But what new urgency? Evil may seem more urgent to us than it did to the Victorian philosophers, favored members of the happiest class in the happiest country in the world at the world's happiest period. But it is no more urgent for us than for the great majority of monotheists all down the ages. The classic expositions of the doctrine that the world's miseries are compatible with its creation and guidance by a wholly good being come from Boethius, waiting in prison to be beaten to death, and from St. Augustine, meditating on the sack of Rome. The present state of the world is normal. It was the last century that was the abnormality. This drives us to ask why so many generations rejected dualism. Not, assuredly, because they were unfamiliar with suffering, and not because its obvious prima facie plausibility escaped them. It is more likely that they saw its two fatal difficulties, the one metaphysical and the other moral. The metaphysical difficulty is this: the two powers, the good and the evil, do not explain each other. Neither Ormuzd nor Ahriman can claim to be the ultimate. More ultimate than either of them is the inexplicable fact of their being there together. Neither of them chose this tete-a-tete. Each of them, therefore, is conditioned, finds himself willy-nilly in a situation, and either that situation itself or some unknown force which produced that situation is the real ultimate. Dualism has not yet reached the ground of being. You cannot accept two conditioned and mutually independent beings as the self-grounded, self-comprehending absolute. On the level of picture thinking, this difficulty is symbolized by our inability to think of Ormuzd and Ahriman without smuggling in the idea of a common space in which they can be together, and thus confessing that we are not yet dealing with the source of the universe, but only with two members contained in it. Dualism is a truncated metaphysic. The moral difficulty is that dualism gives evil a positive, substantive, self-consistent nature, like that of good. If this were true, if Ahriman existed in his own right, no less than Ormuzd, what could we mean by calling Ormuzd good, except that we happen to prefer him? In what sense can the one party be said to be right and the other wrong? If evil has the same kind of reality as good, the same autonomy and completeness, our allegiance to good becomes the arbitrarily chosen loyalty of a partisan. A sound theory of value demands something different. It demands that good should be original and evil a mere perversion, that good should be the tree and evil the ivy, that good should be able to see all round evil, as when sane men understand lunacy, while evil cannot retaliate in kind, that good should be able to exist on its own, while evil requires the good on which it is parasitic in order to continue its parasitic existence. The consequences of neglecting this are serious. It means believing that bad men like badness as such, in the same way in which good men like goodness. At first, this denial of any common nature between us and our enemies seems gratifying. We call them fiends, and feel that we need not forgive them. But, in reality, along with the power to forgive, we have lost the power to condemn. If a taste for cruelty and a taste for kindness were equally ultimate and basic, by what common standard could the one reprove the other? In reality, cruelty does not come from desiring evil as such, but from perverted sexuality, inordinate resentment, or lawless ambition and avarice. That is precisely why it can be judged and condemned from the standpoint of innocent sexuality, righteous anger, and ordinate acquisitiveness. The master can correct a boy's sums because they are blunders in arithmetic, in the same arithmetic which he does and does better. If they were not even attempts at arithmetic, if they were not in the arithmetical world at all, they could not be arithmetical mistakes. Good and evil, then, are not on all fours. Badness is not even bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Almost and Ahriman cannot be equals. In the long run, almost must be original and Ahriman derivative. The first hazy idea of devil must, if we begin to think, be analyzed into the more precise ideas of fallen and rebel angel, but only in the long run. Christianity can go much further with the dualist than Dr. Joad's article seems to suggest. There was never any question of tracing all evil to man. In fact, the New Testament has a good deal more to say about dark superhuman powers than about the fall of Adam. As far as this world is concerned, a Christian can share most of the Zoroastrian outlook. We all live between the fell, incensed points of Michael and Satan. The difference between the Christian and the dualist is that the Christian thinks one stage further and sees that if Michael is really in the right and Satan really in the wrong, this must mean that they stand in two different relations to somebody or something far further back, to the ultimate ground of reality itself. All this, of course, has been watered down in modern times by the theologians who are afraid of mythology. But those who are prepared to reinstate Ormuzd and Ahriman are presumably not squeamish on that score. Dualism can be a manly creed. In the Norse form, the giants will beat the gods in the end, but I am on the side of the gods. Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2. It is nobler by many degrees than most philosophies of the moment. But it is only a halfway house. Thinking along these lines, you can avoid monotheism and remain a dualist only by refusing to follow your thoughts home. To revive dualism would be a real step backwards and a bad omen, though not the worst possible, for civilization. 2. Miracles. I have known only one person in my life who claimed to have seen a ghost. It was a woman. And the interesting thing is that she disbelieved in the immortality of the soul before seeing the ghost, and still disbelieves after having seen it. She thinks it was a hallucination. In other words, seeing is not believing. This is the first thing to get clear in talking about miracles. Whatever experiences we may have, we shall not regard them as miraculous if we already hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural. Any event which is claimed as a miracle is, in the last resort, an experience received from the senses, and the senses are not infallible. We can always say we have been the victims of an illusion. If we disbelieve in the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. Hence, whether miracles have really ceased or not, they would certainly appear to cease in Western Europe as materialism became the popular creed. For let us make no mistake, if the end of the world appeared in all the literal trappings of the apocalypse, if the modern materialist saw with his own eyes the heavens rolled up and the great white throne appearing, if he had the sensation of being himself hurled into the lake of fire, he would continue forever in that lake itself, to regard his experience as an illusion, and to find the explanation of it in psychoanalysis or cerebral pathology. Experience by itself proves nothing. If a man doubts whether he is dreaming or waking, no experiment can solve his doubt, since every experiment may itself be part of the dream. Experience proves this or that or nothing, according to the preconceptions we bring to it. This fact, that the interpretation of experiences depends on preconceptions, is often used as an argument against miracles. It is said that our ancestors, taking the supernatural for granted and greedy of wonders, read the miraculous into events that were not really miracles. And, in a sense, I grant it. That is to say, I think that just as our preconceptions would prevent us from apprehending miracles if they really occurred, so their preconceptions would lead them to imagine miracles even if they did not occur. In the same way, the doting man will think his wife faithful when she is not, and the suspicious man will not think her faithful when she is. The question of her actual fidelity remains, meanwhile, to be settled, if at all, on other grounds. But there is one thing often said about our ancestors which we must not say. We must not say they believed in miracles because they did not know the laws of nature. This is nonsense. When St. Joseph discovered that his bride was pregnant, he was minded to put her away. He knew enough biology for that. Otherwise, of course, he would not have regarded pregnancy as a proof of infidelity. When he accepted the Christian explanation, he regarded it as a miracle precisely because he knew enough of the laws of nature to know that this was a suspension of them. When the disciples saw Christ walking on the water, they were frightened. They would not have been frightened unless they had known the laws of nature and known that this was an exception. If a man had no conception of a regular order in nature, then of course he could not notice departures from that order. Just as a dunce who does not understand the normal meter of a poem is also unconscious of the poet's variations from it. Nothing is wonderful except the abnormal, and nothing is abnormal until we have grasped the norm. Complete ignorance of the laws of nature would preclude the perception of the miraculous just as rigidly as complete disbelief in the supernatural precludes it, perhaps even more so. For while the materialist would have at least to explain miracles away, the man wholly ignorant of nature would simply not notice them. The experience of a miracle in fact requires two conditions. First, we must believe in a normal stability of nature, which means we must recognize that the data offered by our senses recur in regular patterns. Secondly, we must believe in some reality beyond nature. When both beliefs are held, and not till then, we can approach with an open mind the various reports which claim that this super or extra-natural reality has sometimes invaded and disturbed the sensuous content of space and time which makes our natural world. The belief in such a supernatural reality itself can neither be proved nor disproved by experience. The arguments for its existence are metaphysical and, to me, conclusive. They turn on the fact that even to think and act in the natural world, we have to assume something beyond it, and even assume that we partly belong to that something. In order to think, we must claim for our own reasoning a validity which is not credible if our own thought is merely a function of our brain, and our brains a byproduct of irrational physical processes. In order to act above the level of mere impulse, we must claim a similar validity for our judgments of good and evil. In both cases, we get the same disquieting result. The concept of nature itself is one we have reached only tacitly by claiming a sort of supernatural status for ourselves. If we frankly accept this position and then turn to the evidence, we find, of course, that accounts of the supernatural meet us on every side. History is full of them, often in the same documents which we accept wherever they do not report miracles. Respectable missionaries report on them not infrequently. The whole Church of Rome claims their continued occurrence. Intimate conversation elicits from almost every acquaintance at least one episode in his life which is what he would call queer or rum. No doubt most stories of miracles are unreliable, but then, as anyone can see by reading the papers, so are most stories of all events. Each story must be taken on its merits. What one must not do is to rule out the supernatural as the one impossible explanation. Thus you may disbelieve in the Mons angels because you cannot find a sufficient number of sensible people who say they saw them. Lewis is referring to the story that angels appeared protecting British troops in their retreat from Mons, France on the 26th of August 1914. But if you found a sufficient number, it would, in my view, be unreasonable to explain this by collective hallucination. For we know enough of psychology to know that spontaneous unanimity in hallucination is very improbable, and we do not know enough of the supernatural to know that a manifestation of angels is equally improbable. The supernatural theory is the less improbable of the two. When the Old Testament says that Sennacherib's invasion was stopped by angels, and Herodotus says it was stopped by a lot of mice who came and ate up all the bowstrings of his army, an open-minded man will be on the side of the angels. Unless you start by begging the question, there is nothing intrinsically unlikely in the existence of angels or in the action ascribed to them. But mice just don't do these things. A great deal of skepticism now current about the miracles of our Lord does not, however, come from disbelief of all reality beyond nature. It comes from two ideas, which are respectable, but I think mistaken. In the first place, modern people have an almost aesthetic dislike of miracles. Admitting that God can, they doubt if he would. To violate the laws he himself has imposed on his creation seems to them arbitrary, clumsy, a theatrical device only fit to impress savages, a solecism against the grammar of the universe. In the second place, many people confuse the laws of nature with the laws of thought, and imagine that their reversal or suspension would be a contradiction in terms, as if the resurrection of the dead were the same sort of thing as 2 and 2 making 5. I have only recently found the answer to the first objection. I found it first in George MacDonald, and then later in St. Athanasius. This is what St. Athanasius says in his little book on the Incarnation. Our Lord took a body like to ours and lived as a man, in order that those who had refused to recognize him in his superintendence and captaincy of the whole universe might come to recognize from the works he did here below in the body that what dwelled in this body was the Word of God. This accords exactly with Christ's own account of his miracles. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. The doctrine, as I understand it, is something like this. There is an activity of God displayed throughout creation, a wholesale activity, let us say, which men refuse to recognize. The miracles done by God incarnate, living as a man in Palestine, perform the very same things as this wholesale activity, but at a different speed and on a smaller scale. One of their chief purposes is that men, having seen a thing done by personal power on the small scale, may recognize, when they see the same thing done on the large scale, that the power behind it is also personal, is indeed the very same person who lived among us 2,000 years ago. The miracles, in fact, are a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. Of that larger script, part is already visible, part is still unsolved. In other words, some of the miracles do locally what God has already done universally. Others do locally what he has not yet done, but will do. In that sense, and from a human point of view, some are reminders and others prophecies. God creates the vine and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and, with the aid of the sun, to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus every year, from Noah's time till ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. Either, like the pagans, they refer the process to some finite spirit, Bacchus or Dionysus, or else, like the moderns, they attribute real and ultimate causality to the chemical and other material phenomena which are all that our senses can discover in it. But when Christ at Cana makes water into wine, the mask is off. The miracle has only half its effect if it only convinces us that Christ is God. It will have its full effect if, whenever we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine, we remember that here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. Every year God makes a little corn into much corn. The seed is sown, and there is an increase. And men, according to the fashion of their age, say, it is Ceres, it is Adonis, it is the corn king, or else it is the laws of nature. The close-up, the translation of this annual wonder, is the feeding of the 5,000. Bread is not made there of nothing. Bread is not made of stones, as the devil once suggested to our Lord in vain. A little bread is made into much bread. The Son will do nothing but what he sees the Father do. There is, so to speak, a family style. The miracles of healing fall into the same pattern. This is sometimes obscured for us by the somewhat magical view we tend to take of ordinary medicine. The doctors themselves do not take this view. The magic is not in the medicine, but in the patient's body. What the doctor does is to stimulate nature's functions in the body, or to remove hindrances. In a sense, though we speak for convenience of healing a cut, every cut heals itself. No dressing will make skin grow over a cut on a corpse. That same mysterious energy which we call gravitational when it steers the planets and biochemical when it heals a body is the efficient cause of all recoveries. And if God exists, that energy, directly or indirectly, is his. All who are cured by him, the healer within. But once he did it visibly, a man meeting a man. Where he does not work within, in this mode, the organism dies. Hence, Christ's one miracle of destruction is also in harmony with God's wholesale activity. His bodily hand, held out in symbolic wrath, blasted a single fig tree. But no tree died that year in Palestine, or any year, or in any land, or even ever will, save because he has done something, or, more likely, ceased to do something to it. When he fed the thousands, he multiplied fish as well as bread. Look in every bay and almost every river. This swarming, pulsating fecundity shows he is still at work. The ancients had a god called Genius, the god of animal and human fertility, the presiding spirit of gynecology, embryology, or the marriage bed. The genial bed, as they called it after its god, Genius. As the miracles of wine and bread and healing showed who Bacchus really was, who Ceres, who Apollo, and that all were one, so this miraculous multiplication of fish reveals the real Genius. And with that we stand at the threshold of the miracle which, for some reason, most offends modern ears. I can understand the man who denies the miraculous altogether. But what is one to make of the people who admit some miracles but deny the virgin birth? Is it that for all their lip service to the laws of nature, there is only one law of nature that they really believe? Or is it that they see in this miracle a slur upon sexual intercourse, which is rapidly becoming the one thing venerated in a world without veneration? No miracle is in fact more significant. What happens in ordinary generation? What is a father's function in the act of begetting? A microscopic particle of matter from his body fertilizes the female. And with that microscopic particle passes, it may be, the color of his hair and his great-grandfather's hanging lip, and the human form in all its complexity of bones, liver, sinews, heart, and limbs, and pre-human form which the embryo will recapitulate in the womb. Behind every spermatozoon lies the whole history of the universe. Locked within it is no small part of the world's future. That is God's normal way of making a man. A process that takes centuries, beginning with the creation of matter itself and narrowing to 1 second and 1 particle at the moment of begetting. And once again, men will mistake the sense impressions which this creative act throws off for the act itself, or else refer it to some infinite being such as Genius. Once, therefore, God does it directly, instantaneously, without a spermatozoon, without the millenniums of organic history behind the spermatozoon. There was, of course, another reason. This time he was creating not simply a man, but the man who was to be himself, the only true man. The process which leads to the spermatozoon has carried down with it through the centuries much undesirable silt. The life which reaches us by that normal route is tainted. To avoid that taint, to give humanity a fresh start, he once short-circuited the process. There is a vulgar anti-God paper which some anonymous donor sends me every week. In it, recently, I saw the taunt that we Christians believe in a God who committed adultery with the wife of a Jewish carpenter. The answer to that is that if you describe the action of God in fertilizing Mary as adultery, then, in that sense, God would have committed adultery with every woman who ever had a baby. For what he did once without a human father, he does always even when he uses a human father as his instrument. For the human father in ordinary generation is only a carrier, sometimes an unwilling carrier, always the last in a long line of carriers of life that comes from the supreme life. Thus the filth that our poor, muddled, sincere, resentful enemies fling at the Holy One either does not stick, or, sticking, turns into glory. So much for the miracles which do small and quick what we have already seen in the large letters of God's universal activity. But before I go on to the second class, those which foreshadow parts of the universal activity we have not yet seen, I must guard against a misunderstanding. Do not imagine I am trying to make the miracles less miraculous. I am not arguing that they are more probable because they are less like unnatural events. I am trying to answer those who think them arbitrary, theatrical, unworthy of God, meaningless interruptions of universal order. They remain, in my view, wholly miraculous. To do instantly with dead and baked corn what ordinarily happens slowly with live seed is just as great a miracle as to make bread of stones. Just as great, but a different kind of miracle. That is the point. When I open Ovid or Grimm, I find the sort of miracles which really would be arbitrary. Trees talk, houses turn into trees, magic rings raise tables. Men are changed into snakes or birds or bears. It is fun to read about. The least suspicion that it had really happened would turn that fun into nightmare. You find no miracles of that kind in the Gospels. Such things, if they could be, would prove that some alien power was invading nature. They would not in the least prove that it was the same power which had made nature and rules her every day. But the true miracles express not simply a God, but God. That which is outside nature, not as a foreigner, but as her sovereign. They announce not merely that a king has visited our town, but that it is the king, our king. The second class of miracles, on this view, foretell what God has not yet done, but will do universally. He raised one man, the man who was himself, from the dead, because he will one day raise all men from the dead. Perhaps not only men, for there are hints in the New Testament that all creation will eventually be rescued from decay, restored to shape, and subserve the splendor of remade humanity. The transfiguration and the walking on the water are glimpses of the beauty and the effortless power over all matter which will belong to men when they are really waked by God. Now, resurrection certainly involves reversal of natural process in the sense that it involves a series of changes moving in the opposite direction to those we see. At death, matter which has been organic falls back gradually into the inorganic, to be finally scattered and used, perhaps, in other organisms. Resurrection would be the reverse process. It would not, of course, mean the restoration to each personality of those very atoms, numerically the same, which had made its first or natural body. There would not be enough to go round, for one thing, and for another, the unity of the body even in this life was consistent with the slow but perplexed change of its actual ingredients. But it certainly does mean matter of some kind rushing towards organism as we now see it rushing away. It means, in fact, playing backwards a film we have already seen played forwards. In that sense, it is a reversal of nature. But, of course, it is a further question whether reversal in this sense is necessarily contradiction. Do we know that the film cannot be played backwards? Well, in one sense, it is precisely the teaching of modern physics that the film never works backwards. For modern physics, as you have heard before, the universe is running down. Disorganization and chance is continually increasing. There will come a time, not infinitely remote, when it will be wholly run down or wholly disorganized, and science knows of no possible return from that state. There must have been a time, not infinitely remote, in the past when it was wound up, though science knows of no winding up process. The point is that for our ancestors, the universe was a picture. For modern physics, it is a story. If the universe is a picture, these things either appear in that picture or not. And if they don't, since it is an infinite picture, one may suspect that they are contrary to the nature of things. But a story is a different matter, especially if it is an incomplete story. And the story told by modern physics might be told briefly in the words, Humpty Dumpty was falling. That is, it proclaims itself an incomplete story. There must have been a time before he fell, when he was sitting on the wall. There must be a time after he had reached the ground. It is quite true that science knows of no horses and men who can put him together again once he has reached the ground and broken. But then she also knows of no means by which he could originally have been put on the wall. You wouldn't expect her to. All science rests on observation. All our observations are taken during Humpty Dumpty's fall, because we were born after he lost his seat on the wall, and shall be extinct long before he reaches the ground. But to assume from observations taken while the clock is running down that the unimaginable winding up which must have preceded this process cannot occur when the process is over is the merest dogmatism. From the very nature of the case, the laws of degradation and disorganization which we find in nature at present cannot be the ultimate and eternal nature of things. If they were, there would have been nothing to degrade and disorganize. Humpty Dumpty can't fall off a wall that never existed. Obviously, an event which lies outside the falling or disintegrating process which we know as nature is not imaginable. If anything is clear from the records of our Lord's appearances after his resurrection, it is that the risen body was very different from the body that died, and that it lives under conditions quite unlike those of natural life. It is frequently not recognized by those who see it, and it is not related to space in the same way as our bodies. The sudden appearances and disappearances suggest the ghost of popular tradition, yet he emphatically insists that he is not merely a spirit, and takes steps to demonstrate that the risen body can still perform animal operations, such as eating. What makes all this baffling to us is our assumption that to pass beyond what we call nature, beyond the 3 dimensions and the 5 highly specialized and limited senses, is immediately to be in a world of pure negative spirituality, a world where space of any sort and sense of any sort has no function. I know no grounds for believing this. To explain even an atom, the Austrian physicist Arthur Schrödinger wants 7 dimensions. And give us new senses, and we should find a new nature. There may be natures piled upon natures, each supernatural to the one beneath it, before we come to the abyss of pure spirit. And to be in that abyss, at the right hand of the Father, may not mean being absent from any of these natures, may mean a yet more dynamic presence on all levels. That is why I think it very rash to assume that the story of the Ascension is mere allegory. I know it sounds like the work of people who imagined an absolute up and down and a local heaven in the sky. But to say this is, after all, to say, assuming that the story is fake, we could thus explain how it arose. Without that assumption, we find ourselves moving about in worlds unrealized, with no probability or improbability to guide us. For if the story is true, then a being still in some mode, though not our mode, corporeal, withdrew at his own will from the nature presented by our 3 dimensions and 5 senses, not necessarily into the non-sensuous and undimensioned, but possibly into or through a world or worlds of supersense and superspace. And he might choose to do it gradually. Who on earth knows what the spectators might see? If they say they saw a momentary movement along the vertical plane, then an indistinct mass, then nothing, who is to pronounce this improbable? My time is nearly up, and I must be very brief with the second class of people whom I promised to deal with, those who mistake the laws of nature for laws of thought, and, therefore, think that any departure from them is a self-contradiction, like a square circle or 2 and 2 making 5. To think this is to imagine that the normal processes of nature are transparent to the intellect, that we can say why she behaves as she does. For, of course, if we cannot see why a thing is so, then we cannot see any reason why it should not be otherwise. But in fact, the actual course of nature is wholly inexplicable. I don't mean that science has not yet explained it, but may do so some day. I mean that the very nature of explanation makes it impossible that we should even explain why matter has the properties it has. For explanation, by its very nature, deals with a world of ifs and ands. Every explanation takes the form, since A, therefore B, or if C, then D. In order to explain any event, you have to assume the universe as a going concern, a machine working in a particular way. Since this particular way of working is the basis of all explanation, it can never be itself explained. We can see no reason why it should not have worked a different way. To say this is not only to remove the suspicion that miracle is self-contradictory, but also to realize how deeply right St. Athanasius was when he found an essential likeness between the miracles of our Lord and the general order of nature. Both are a full stop for the explaining intellect. If the natural means that which can be fitted into a class, that which obeys a norm, that which can be paralleled, that which can be explained by reference to other events, then nature herself as a whole is not natural. If a miracle means that which must simply be accepted, the unanswerable actuality which gives no account of itself but simply is, then the universe is one great miracle. To direct us to that great miracle is one main object of the earthly acts of Christ, that are, as he himself said, signs. They serve to remind us that the explanations of particular events which we derive from the given, the unexplained, the almost willful character of the actual universe, are not explanations of that character. These signs do not take us away from reality, they recall us to it, recall us from our dream world of ifs and ands to the stunning actuality of everything that is real. They are focal points at which more reality becomes visible than we ordinarily see at once. I have spoken of how he made miraculous bread and wine, and of how, when the Virgin conceived, he had shown himself the true genius whom men had ignorantly worshipped long before. It goes deeper than that. Bread and wine were to have an even more sacred significance for Christians, and the act of generations was to be the chosen symbol among all mystics for the union of the soul with God. These things are no accidents. With him there are no accidents. When he created the vegetable world, he knew already what dreams the annual death and resurrection of the corn would cause to stir in pious pagan minds. He knew already that he himself must so die and live again, and in what sense, including and far transcending the old religion of the Corn King. He would say, "This is my body." Common bread, miraculous bread, sacramental bread. These three are distinct, but not to be separated. Divine reality is like a fugue. All his acts are different, but they all rhyme or echo to one another. It is this that makes Christianity so difficult to talk about. Fix your mind on any one story or any one doctrine, and it becomes at once a magnet to which truth and glory come rushing from all levels of being. Our featureless pantheistic unities and glib rationalist distinctions are alike defeated by the seamless yet ever-varying texture of reality, the liveness, the elusiveness, the intertwined harmonies of the multidimensional fertility of God. But if this is the difficulty, it is also one of the firm grounds of our belief. To think that this was a fable, a product of our own brains as they are a product of matter, would be to believe that this vast symphonic splendor had come out of something much smaller and emptier than itself. It is not so. We are nearer to the truth in the vision seen by Julian of Norwich when Christ appeared to her holding in his hand a little thing like a hazelnut and saying, "This is all that is created." And it seemed to her so small and weak that she wondered how it could hold together at all. 3. Dogma and the Universe. It is a common reproach against Christianity that its dogmas are unchanging, while human knowledge is in continual growth. Hence, to unbelievers, we seem to be always engaged in the hopeless task of trying to force the new knowledge into molds which it has outgrown. I think this feeling alienates the outsider much more than any particular discrepancies between this or that doctrine and this or that scientific theory. We may, as we say, get over dozens of isolated difficulties, but that does not alter his sense that the endeavor as a whole is doomed to failure and perverse. Indeed, the more ingenious, the more perverse. For it seems to him clear that, if our ancestors had known what we know about the universe, Christianity would never have existed at all. And, however we patch and mend, no system of thought which claims to be immutable can, in the long run, adjust itself to our growing knowledge. That is the position I am going to try to answer. But before I go on to what I regard as the fundamental answer, I would like to clear up certain points about the actual relations between Christian doctrine and the scientific knowledge we already have. That is a different matter from the continual growth of knowledge we imagine, whether rightly or wrongly, in the future, and which, as some think, is bound to defeat us in the end. In one respect, as many Christians have noticed, contemporary science has recently come into line with Christian doctrine, and parted company with the classical forms of materialism. If anything emerges clearly from modern physics, it is that nature is not everlasting. The universe had a beginning, and will have an end. But the great materialistic systems of the past all believed in the eternity, and thence in the self-existence of matter. As Professor Whittaker said in the Riddle Lectures of 1942, it was never possible to oppose seriously the dogma of the creation, except by maintaining that the world has existed from all eternity in more or less its present state. This fundamental ground for materialism has now been withdrawn. We should not lean too heavily on this, for scientific theories change. But at the moment it appears that the burden of proof rests not on us, but on those who deny that nature has some cause beyond herself. In popular thought, however, the origin of the universe has counted, I think, for less than its character, its immense size and its apparent indifference, if not hostility, to human life. And very often this impresses people all the more because it is supposed to be a modern discovery. an excellent example of those things which our ancestors did not know, and which, if they had known them, would have prevented the very beginnings of Christianity. Here there is a simple historical falsehood. Ptolemy knew just as well as Eddington that the earth was infinitesimal in comparison with the whole content of space. There is no question here of knowledge having grown until the frame of archaic thought is no longer able to contain it. The real question is why the spatial insignificance of the earth, after being known for centuries, should suddenly in the last century have become an argument against Christianity. I do not know why this has happened, but I am sure it does not mark an increased clarity of thought, for the argument from size is, in my opinion, very feeble. When the doctor at a post-mortem diagnoses poison, pointing to the state of the dead man's organs, his argument is rational because he has a clear idea of that opposite state in which the organs would have been found if no poison were present. In the same way, if we use the vastness of space and the smallness of earth to disprove the existence of God, we ought to have a clear idea of the sort of universe we should expect if God did exist. But have we? Whatever space may be in itself, and of course some moderns think it finite, we certainly perceive it as three-dimensional, and to three-dimensional space we can conceive no boundaries. By the very forms of our perceptions, therefore, we must feel as if we lived somewhere in infinite space. If we discovered no objects in this infinite space except those which are of use to man, our own sun and moon, then this vast emptiness would certainly be used as a strong argument against the existence of God. If we discover other bodies, they must be habitable or uninhabitable. And the odd thing is that both these hypotheses are used as grounds for rejecting Christianity. If the universe is teeming with life, this, we are told, reduces to absurdity the Christian claim, or what is thought to be the Christian claim, that man is unique, and the Christian doctrine that to this one planet God came down and was incarnate for us men and our salvation. If, on the other hand, the earth is really unique, then that proves that life is only an accidental byproduct in the universe, and so again disproves our religion. Really, we are hard to please. We treat God as the police treat a man when he is arrested. Whatever he does will be used in evidence against him. I do not think this is due to our wickedness. I suspect there is something in our very mode of thought which makes it inevitable that we should always be baffled by actual existence, whatever character actual existence may have. Perhaps a finite and contingent creature, a creature that might not have existed, will always find it hard to acquiesce in the brute fact that it is, here and now, attached to an actual order of things. However that may be, it is certain that the whole argument from size rests on the assumption that differences of size ought to coincide with differences of value. For unless they do, there is of course no reason why the minute earth and the yet smaller human creatures upon it should not be the most important things in a universe that contains the spiral nebulae. Now, is this assumption rational or emotional? I feel, as well as anyone else, the absurdity of supposing that the galaxy could be of less moment in God's eyes than such an atom as a human being. But I notice that I feel no similar absurdity in supposing that a man of 5 feet high may be more important than another man who is 5 feet 3.5, nor that a man may matter more than a tree, or a brain more than a leg. In other words, the feeling of absurdity arises only if the differences of size are very great. But where a relation is perceived by reason, it holds good universally. If size and value had any real connection, small differences in size would accompany small differences in value, as surely as large differences in size accompany large differences in value. But no sane man could suppose that this is so. I don't think the taller man slightly more valuable than the shorter one. I don't allow a slight superiority to trees over men, and then neglect it because it is too small to bother about. I perceive, as long as I am dealing with the small differences of size, that they have no connection with value whatsoever. I therefore conclude that the importance attached to the great differences of size is an affair not of reason, but of emotion, of that peculiar emotion which superiorities in size produce only after a certain point of absolute size has been reached. We are inveterate poets. Our imaginations awake. Instead of mere quantity, we now have a quality, the sublime. Unless this were so, the merely arithmetical greatness of the galaxy would be no more impressive than the figures in a telephone directory. It is thus, in a sense, from ourselves that the material universe derives its power to overawe us. To a mind which did not share our emotions and lacked our imaginative energies, the argument from size would be sheerly meaningless. Men look on the starry heavens with reverence. Monkeys do not. The silence of the eternal spaces terrified Pascal, but it was the greatness of Pascal that enabled them to do so. When we are frightened by the greatness of the universe, we are, almost literally, frightened by our own shadows. For these light years and billions of centuries are mere arithmetic until the shadow of man, the poet, the maker of myth, falls upon them. I do not say we are wrong to tremble at his shadow. It is a shadow of an image of God. But if ever the vastness of matter threatens to overcross our spirits, one must remember that it is matter spiritualized which does so. To puny man, the great nebula in Andromeda owes in a sense its greatness. And this drives me to say yet again that we are hard to please. If the world in which we found ourselves were not vast and strange enough to give us Pascal's terror, what poor creatures we should be. Being what we are, rational but also animate, amphibians who start from the world of sense and proceed through myth and metaphor to the world of spirit, I do not see how we could have come to know the greatness of God without that hint furnished by the greatness of the material universe. Once again, what sort of universe do we demand? If it were small enough to be cozy, it would not be big enough to be sublime. If it is large enough for us to stretch our spiritual limbs in, it must be large enough to baffle us. Cramped or terrified, we must, in any conceivable world, be one or the other. I prefer terror. I should be suffocated in a universe that I could see to the end of. Have you never, when walking in a wood, turned back deliberately for fear you should come out at the other side, and thus make it ever after in your imagination a mere beggarly strip of trees? I hope you do not think I am suggesting that God made the spiral nebulae solely or chiefly in order to give me the experience of awe and bewilderment. I have not the faintest idea why he made them. On the whole, I think it would be rather surprising if I had. As far as I understand the matter, Christianity is not wedded to an anthropocentric view of the universe as a whole. The first chapters of Genesis, no doubt, give the story of creation in the form of a folk tale, a fact recognized as early as the time of St. Jerome, and if you take them alone, you might get that impression. But it is not confirmed by the Bible as a whole. There are few places in the literature where we are more sternly warned against making man the measure of all things than in the book of Job. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for a servant? Shall not one be cast down even at the sight of him? In St. Paul, the powers of the sky seem usually to be hostile to man. It is, of course, the essence of Christianity that God loves man and for his sake became man and died. But that does not prove that man is the sole end of nature. In the parable, it was the one lost sheep that the shepherd went in search of. It was not the only sheep in the flock, and we are not told that it was the most valuable, save in so far as the most desperately in need has, while the need lasts, a peculiar value in the eyes of love. The doctrine of the Incarnation would conflict with what we know of this vast universe only if we knew also that there were other rational species in it who had, like us, fallen, and who needed redemption in the same mode, and that they had not been vouchsafed it. But we know none of these things. It may be full of life that needs no redemption. It may be full of life that has been redeemed. It may be full of things quite other than life, which satisfy the divine wisdom in fashions one cannot conceive. We are in no position to draw up maps of God's psychology and prescribe limits to his interests. We would not do so even for a man whom we knew to be greater than ourselves. The doctrines that God is love and that he delights in men are positive doctrines, not limiting doctrines. He is not less than this. What more he may be, we do not know. We know only that he must be more than we can conceive. It is to be expected that his creation should be, in the main, unintelligible to us. Christians themselves have been much to blame for the misunderstanding on these matters. They have a bad habit of talking as if revelation existed to gratify curiosity by illuminating all creation so that it becomes self-explanatory and all questions are answered. But revelation appears to me to be purely practical, to be addressed to the particular animal, fallen man, for the relief of his urgent necessities, not to the spirit of inquiry in man for the gratification of his liberal curiosity. We know that God has visited and redeemed his people, and that tells us just as much about the general character of the creation as a dose given to one sick hen on a big farm tells it about the general character of farming in England. What we must do, which road we must take to the fountain of life, we know, and none who has seriously followed the directions complains that he has been deceived. But whether there are other creatures like ourselves, and how they are dealt with, whether inanimate matter exists only to serve living creatures or for some other reason, whether the immensity of space is a means to some end or an illusion, or simply the natural mode in which infinite energy might be expected to create, on all these points I think we are left to our own speculations. No, it is not Christianity which need fear the giant universe. It is those systems which place the whole meaning of existence in biological or social evolution on our own planet. It is the creative evolutionist, the Bergsonian or Shavian or the communist who should tremble when he looks up at the night sky. For he really is committed to a sinking ship. He really is attempting to ignore the discovered nature of things, as though by concentrating on the possibly upward trend in a single planet, he could make himself forget the inevitable downward trend in the universe as a whole, the trend to low temperatures and irrevocable disorganization. For entropy is the real cosmic wave, and evolution only a momentary tellurian ripple within it. On these grounds, then, I submit that we Christians have as little to fear as anyone from the knowledge actually acquired. But, as I said at the beginning, that is not the fundamental answer. The endless fluctuations of scientific theory, which seem today so much friendlier to us than in the last century, may turn against us tomorrow. The basic answer lies elsewhere. Let me remind you of the question we are trying to answer. It is this: how can an unchanging system survive the continual increase of knowledge? Now, in certain cases, we know very well how it can. A mature scholar reading a great passage in Plato and taking in at one glance the metaphysics, the literary beauty, and the place of both in the history of Europe is in a very different position from a boy learning the Greek alphabet. Yet through that unchanging system of the alphabet, all this vast mental and emotional activity is operating. It has not been broken by the new knowledge. It is not outworn. If it changed, all would be chaos. A great Christian statesman, considering the morality of a measure which will affect millions of lives and which involves economic, geographical, and political considerations of the utmost complexity, is in a different position from a boy first learning that one must not cheat, or tell lies, or hurt innocent people. But only insofar as that first knowledge of the great moral platitude survives unimpaired in the statesman will his deliberation be moral at all. If that goes, then there has been no progress, but only mere change. For change is not progress unless the core remains unchanged. A small oak grows into a big oak. If it became a beech, that would not be growth, but mere change. And thirdly, there is a great difference between counting apples and arriving at the mathematical formulae of modern physics. But the multiplication table is used in both and does not grow out of date. In other words, wherever there is real progress in knowledge, there is some knowledge that is not superseded. Indeed, the very possibility of progress demands that there should be an unchanging element. New bottles for new wine by all means, but not new palates, throats, and stomachs, or it would not be, for us, wine at all. I take it we should all agree to find this sort of unchanging element in the simple rules of mathematics. I would add to these the primary principles of morality, and I would also add the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. To put it in rather more technical language, I claim that the positive historical statements made by Christianity have the power, elsewhere found chiefly in formal principles, of receiving, without intrinsic change, the increasing complexity of meaning which increasing knowledge puts into them. For example, it may be true, though I don't for a moment suppose it is, that when the Nicene Creed said, "He came down from heaven," the writers had in mind a local movement from a local heaven to the surface of the earth, like a parachute descent. Others since may have dismissed the idea of a spatial heaven altogether. But neither the significance nor the credibility of what is asserted seems to be in the least affected by the change. On either view, the thing is miraculous. On either view, the mental images which attend the act of belief are inessential. When a Central African convert and a Harley Street specialist both affirm that Christ rose from the dead, there is, no doubt, a very great difference between their thoughts. To one, the simple picture of a dead body getting up is sufficient. The other may think of a whole series of biochemical and even physical processes beginning to work backwards. The doctor knows that, in his experience, they never have worked backwards. But the Negro knows that dead bodies don't get up and walk. Both are faced with miracle, and both know it. If both think miracle impossible, the only difference is that the doctor will expound the impossibility in much greater detail, will give an elaborate gloss on the simple statement that dead men don't walk about. If both believe, all the doctor says will merely analyze and explicate the words, "He rose." When the author of Genesis says that God made man in his own image, he may have pictured a vaguely corporeal God making man as a child makes a figure out of plasticine. A modern Christian philosopher may think of a process lasting from the first creation of matter to the final appearance on this planet of an organism fit to receive spiritual as well as biological life. But both mean essentially the same thing. Both are denying the same thing. The doctrine that matter by some blind power inherent in itself has produced spirituality. Does this mean that Christians on different levels of general education conceal radically different beliefs under an identical form of words? Certainly not. For what they agree on is the substance, and what they differ about is the shadow. When one imagines his God seated in a local heaven above a flat earth, where another sees God and creation in terms of Professor Whitehead's philosophy, this difference touches precisely what does not matter. Perhaps this seems to you an exaggeration. But is it? As regards material reality, we are now being forced to the conclusion that we know nothing about it save its mathematics. The tangible beach and pebbles of our first calculators, the imaginable atoms of Democritus, the plain man's picture of space turn out to be the shadow. Numbers are the substance of our knowledge, the sole liaison between mind and things. What nature is in herself evades us. What seem to naive perception to be the evident things about her turn out to be the most phantasmal. It is something the same with our knowledge of spiritual reality. What God is in himself, how he is to be conceived by philosophers, retreats continually from our knowledge. The elaborate world pictures which accompany religion, and which look each so solid while they last, turn out to be only shadows. It is religion itself, prayer and sacrament and repentance and adoration, which is here, in the long run, our sole avenue to the real. Like mathematics, religion can grow from within or decay. The Jew knows more than the pagan, the Christian more than the Jew, the modern vaguely religious man less than any of the three. But like mathematics, it remains simply itself, capable of being applied to any new theory of the material universe and outmoded by none. When any man comes into the presence of God, he will find, whether he wishes it or not, that all those things which seem to make him so different from the men of other times, or even from his earlier self, have fallen off him. He is back where he always was, where every man always is. Eadem sunt omnia semper. Everything is always the same. Do not let us deceive ourselves. No possible complexity which we can give to our picture of the universe can hide us from God. There is no copse, no forest, no jungle thick enough to provide cover. We read in Revelation of him that sat on the throne, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away. It may happen to any of us at any moment, in the twinkling of an eye, in a time too small to be measured, and in any place. All that seems to divide us from God can flee away, vanish, leaving us naked before him, like the first man, like the only man, as if nothing but he and I existed. And since that contact cannot be avoided for long, and since it means either bliss or horror, the business of life is to learn to like it. That is the first and great commandment. 4.